On the eve of the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine, there are growing concerns about Kyiv's ability to continue fighting effectively.
Well, the country, we know, is desperately short of artillery and ammunition and has made little territorial gains over the last year.
There's also division amongst politicians in the US on continued support for the embattled nation.
Well, the UK, though, has remained steadfast in its support, providing more than £7 billion in military aid over the last 2 years.
A £200 million programme to provide thousands of extra military drones has now been agreed.
Britain has also trained 60,000 Ukrainian troops, provided 6 million rounds of small arms ammunition and 8,000 rounds of tank artillery.
Well, our security editor, Mark White, has this special report.
Across large parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, the war with Russia continues to rage. And as this conflict enters its third year, the scale of the destruction and the number of casualties inflicted on both sides has been immense. The Ukrainian army was widely praised for its early successes, driving the numerically superior and better equipped Russian military back from significant chunks of the territory it seized in the early days of the invasion. But military analysts agree the war of late appears to have reached stalemate.
When I think about it now, I can't help but think about World War I, 1916, 1917, offensive operations, capturing very little ground, a lot of casualties, and doesn't seem to be making any advances one way or the other. So I think we're in a stalemate situation, and I rather suspect this is going to be the case for some time.
There's no doubt Ukraine has defied the odds in ensuring Russia, for now at least, is unable to do much more than defend the current territory it holds. An assessment of Ukraine's achievements so far by the UK's Ministry of Defence estimates the country's armed forces have recaptured 50% of the territory Russia seized in 2022. 350,000 Russian troops are believed to have been killed or injured. 2,600 Russian tanks have been destroyed over the past 2 years, and almost 5,000 Russian armoured vehicles have also been destroyed. On the Ukrainian side, at least 30,000 civilians have been killed, probably many more. The number of military deaths is a closely guarded secret, but some estimates put it as high as 70,000. In this war of attrition, Ukraine is running desperately short of artillery shells and ammunition. And with last year's counter-offensive failing to achieve the significant gains Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had hoped for, he's now removed his top general. Add to that serious concerns surrounding continued support from the United States, with the Republicans repeatedly blocking a new military aid package for Ukraine. The spectre of a new Donald Trump presidency just compounds the concern in Kyiv that Ukraine's biggest supplier of military aid may no longer be as committed to its defence. One Russian opposition politician believes that ultimately the war is unlikely to be won on the battlefield and instead needs new leadership in the Kremlin.
I think that this war, at the end of the day, will not end in Ukraine. It will end in Moscow. The origin of the problem is in Moscow. The source of the problem is in Moscow. And it should be treated in Moscow. And that's what I am currently doing. I am campaigning for all the different Western nations to come to this realization and help our regiments in the front lines and our groups inside Russia to grow and to be able to change this regime from within.
For now, at least, there seems little prospect of Vladimir Putin's removal, enforced or otherwise. And he's on course to once again win the country's presidential elections next month. Moscow has also now shifted to a wartime economy and invested huge sums in its military, which the West is struggling to match. After another year of massive battlefield losses on both sides, neither country has the advantage. But Ukraine and Russia agree on one thing. There's no prospect of a ceasefire and negotiations anytime soon. So this bloody conflict is set to rage on, testing not just Ukraine's ability to keep fighting, but its allies' resolve in staying the course and continuing to supply the military aid this country so desperately needs. Mark White, GB News.
Well, former head of counter-terrorism at the Ministry of Defence, Major General Chip Chapman, joins us now. Very good to see you this morning. And it is really interesting, isn't it, listening to Mark White's report there, that the fighting is taking place in eastern Ukraine, but actually the outcome of this war relies on the West.
Well, all wars are fought for political objectives, so of course they're determined by what happens in Moscow and what happens in Western capitals. One of the objectives for the Russians in the third year is to find ways to divide the international community and search for laggards within that. We saw that in year 2 with Hungary, and we're seeing it at the moment with the sort of Putin part of the Republican Party, where the House of Representatives are holding up the $60 billion bill. I think you can probably say at the moment that it is an eroding stalemate. It's a very slow erosion, but erosion can become a landslide. In a way, it's very reminiscent of what happened in June 2022, where a Republican Congressman Mike Vaught said that Ukraine were losing slowly. At that time, they needed to equalize the battlefield with HIMARS, precision strike, and artillery. That is what needs to happen again, particularly with the aid package, the held-up aid package from the Americans. It's not true that the Americans provide the bulk of the military aid in terms of pure financial might. The EU and the UK have provided $48.7 billion of military aid, the US $46.33. But it's the scale and speed at which the Americans can get things there, particularly the 155 artillery ammunition and the HIMARS long-range deep strike rockets, which are important for the future.
But what causes a lot of concern, I guess, Chip, is the idea that because this is moving so slowly, 2 years in already, which is mind-blowing, frankly, and at such cost, is that sustainable? How prepared do you think people are to sustain that, to hold Putin back?
Well, the first point to make is that a study of over 200 conflicts shows that the 2-year point is the point that you're least likely to produce a ceasefire or negotiations. The case to support Ukraine is really threefold. The first one is the security case, that it's in your geostrategic and geopolitical interest because they are the persistent threat, and to diminish that makes sense. The second one is the moral case. They've invaded a sovereign country against the UN Charter and other things like the Budapest Agreement in 1994 and committed genocide. We've kind of forgotten Bucha and Irpin. And the third one is actually, it's economically quite cheap. It's 0.02% of GDP. In benchmark terms from the UK, that is 1/100th of the benefits bill. So it's not really a case of can we support Ukraine? It's a war that we cannot afford to lose because it is a revanchist Russia which seeks to regain lost territory and spheres of influence.